In this video I will give an overview of certain points from the second episode of King and Conqueror before giving the history of these points and then reviewing the episode. The episode starts with a confrontation on the beach with a man and his bodyguard being dispatched by Godwin and his men. More on this later in the review. Godwin is asked by the king to talk. Godwin lets Edward be in control and expresses sentiment about not wanting war and that he, Godwin, can talk his way out of everything. Harold discusses with his father that the king needs to be in charge, making rules good for everyone. Githa, upon discovering Edith's pregnancy, said to keep quiet and that she kept Tostig's pregnancy secret when Godwin was at war. Morcar, presented as Earl of Mercia in the show, is at the meeting between the king and Godwin, and he accuses Godwin for breaking the peace. Emma confiscates Godwin's lands and seizing them for the crown, per the peace agreement made by Godwin. Godwin and his sons are to be exiled. Godwin agrees to this, but Harold publicly disagrees, pointing out Mercian involvement. Godwin is given a week to leave. Emma then proposes to Godwin that he can have his lands back if Godwin gives Ethel back to her, and she talks about undoing Alfred's work. William plans to escape, and Henry wants William gone and hunts him. While on the run, Matilda gives birth to a son, and William is distant towards his son, fearing that Henry will deal badly with his son. Earl Morcar wants the earldom of Wessex because he was promised to him for stirring things up, and Emma implies to Morcar that to many, Godwin will always be Earl of Wessex so long as he lives. Godwin flees willingly, not wanting war, and he plans to go to Flanders. It comes up that Godwin dispatched Ethel to put Edward on the throne because he, Edward, is weak and would marry one of Godwin's daughters, and Ethel wouldn't. So Godwin dispatched him by putting his eyes out, and that Godwin saved Wessex just as Alfred did. William goes into exile in Flanders, and then Mercian raiders then attack the Godwin family at their compound, and there is a battle, and Edith is captured. Edward trusts Emma, and she kept him alive, and she is behind the entire conspiracy. On the beach, when the Godwins were preparing to go to Flanders, Harold discovers that Edith has been captured, and he wants to go back to save her, but he is stopped by his mother. Turning to the history, which is far more interesting than the show, I would like to start by reiterating a few points from my review of the first episode. That Morcar was not Earl of Mercia, it was Leofric, and Emma's career ended in 1043 when Edward, after his coronation along with the three earls, confronted her, retiring her to a nunnery, with Edward seizing her lands. She would be released later on from the nunnery, but in effect her career was over. Also, Mercian raids into Wessex to stir up civil war is not correct, but more on this in a moment, as general explanation as to the 1051 crisis. Godwin dispatching Ethel, who really is actually Alfred, Edward's full brother, to put Edward on the throne because Ethel wouldn't marry Godwin, and Edward would, and that Edward was weak. Now, historically, Edward marrying Edith, Godwin's daughter, was a means of Edward gaining Godwin's support in the early part of Edward's reign. Now, coming to the real Ethel, i.e. Alfred, the king's brother, there is some debate as to how involved Godwin was in Alfred's demise. Alfred tried to reach his mother at Winchester, and he landed with a force of Normans. There is, again, some debate as to whether Emma wrote to her sons inviting them, or whether Harold faked the letter, which Emma would claim in her autobiography. Godwin met Alfred as a friend, promising to escort him to his mother, even proposing the kingship to him. But instead, Godwin captured Alfred, slaughtered Alfred's army before handing Alfred over to Harold Hereford, who then had him blinded. Alfred subsequently succumbed. Whether Godwin was more involved in this is not known. Harthacnut and Edward believed he had a greater involvement in their brother's death, which Godwin denied. Godwin had initially supported Harthacnut in 1035, but he switched over to supporting Harold Hereford when Harthacnut was detained defending Denmark from threats from Norway, and Godwin needed to prove his loyalty to Hereford, thereby acting in league with him against Alfred. In terms of Edward being weak, whether he was a weak character is open to debate, but politically he was in a weak position. He had spent 25 years in exile, he was a stranger in his own land when he returned to England, dominated by three earls with their power bases of their own, and Godwin was the most powerful. Edward had no power base of his own in that he had no network of loyal retainers. that the earls had spent 25 years cultivating. He had no concentrated power base. Even though he was wealthy, his lands were spread over a wide area, and his ancestral kingdom and heartland of Wessex was now in the hands of Godwin. Now, the reason why I say the ancestral kingdom and heartland is because the kings of England were once kings of Wessex, and that was originally their domain. These reasons, along with his lengthy exile in Normandy, could have influenced Edward in bringing his Norman supporters along with him and trying to establish them, and why he seized the chance the 1051 crisis gave him to remove Godwin, whose wealth and power rivaled his own, so Edward could beef up his own power base. And I'll have a note from Frank Barlow what he said about the division of land later on, and also for Edward to gain revenge for his brother Alfred. In terms of Godwin wanted to keep the peace and talking his way out of everything and willingness to accept exile, to a point this is fine, in that both sides wanted to refrain from civil war, but Godwin and his sons conducted raids on the south coast. I will discuss more on these points in detail. Upon their respective ascensions, both Harthacnut and Edward mistrusted Godwin over the demise of their brother Alfred. Godwin gifted both of them a large ship upon their respective ascensions to the throne, and he tried to shift the blame onto Harold Hereford. This is an example of talking his way out of things. The point about not wanting war is not limited to Godwin, but the other earls and thanes as well. For example, the thanes, an army Godwin gathered in 1051, did not want to fight the king, and they melted away, especially after the earls Leofric and Silwood raised forces of their own to support the king, along with the king's nephew Ralph the Timid. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions those on the king's side who wanted to avoid the armies coming together because they were the noblest part of England, becoming engaged in a destructive conflict that would allow England's foe entry. As Mark Morris said in an interview during the 1066 A Year to Conquer England programme, the English had learned from the beginning of the 11th century that disunity allowed the Vikings in. Ironically, that disunity was actually caused by Ethelred's inability to deal with the Viking threat over many years and paying them off, causing more Viking raids, ultimately leading to the overthrow of the House of Wessex. Now, the raising of an army in 1051 by Godwin and his sons, Sweyn and Harold, shows that Godwin did not accept exile willingly. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes that Godwin was willing to resist, but they were loath to proceed against their natural lord, being advised by peers on both sides that they should abstain from all hostility. Now, this is showing restraint from full-blown civil war, whilst at the same time posturing to deal with what was becoming a big issue. Now, Edward did declare Godwin and his sons outlaws after they fled from a proposed meeting set to be at London, and they were given 5 days to depart. The episode mentions a week. Forces that were sent after Godwin and his family, but as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes, these forces could not or would not apprehend them. This puts the battle scene with Morcar as unrealistic. It is also interesting that Godwin's son Wulfnoth and his grandson Hakon, who's Sven's son, were taken hostages, and they would ultimately end up in Normandy. Now, this is a potential reason for Harold's crossing in 1064. When Godwin returned in 1052, he raided Portland. Harold raided Portlock in the West Country before meeting his father at the Isle of Wight and raided there, in addition to the Isle of Sheppey and the Milton Regis areas as well, again showing that Godwin did not accept exile willingly. Godwin did gain significant popular support, and Edward had an army and he wanted to fight, but those in Edward's army were reluctant to fight their kinsmen. The Earls Leofric and Silwood were by this time reluctant to support the king, and peace was urged. Godwin swore oaths to the king about his involvement with Alfred's demise, and cleared his name. On the surface, at least, this was accepted by Edward. Whether he accepted this personally or not is for a different matter, and Godwin was restored to his earldom. This shows that members of either side were showing restraint, not wanting a full-blown civil war by destroying each other and allowing foes in, but at the same time it shows that Godwin was wanting to maintain his position and that he wouldn't go into exile willingly. So it's basically a cross between the two. In terms of Emma confiscating Godwin's lands and seizing them for the crown, this was actually Edward. Emma by this time had very little power and was retired. Indeed, she would pass away in March 1052. The show also has Morcar demanding Wessex. Now, according to Frank Barlow, Edward kept the eastern shires of Wessex following Godwin's exile. Odo of Deerhurst, who was a kinsman of Edward, got the western shires of Wessex. Edward's nephew Ralph got Swains earldom, roughly around in the West Country, and into the southern Midlands, into southern Mercia. And Leofric's son Elfgar got the earldom of East Anglia. The episode has Emma promising to Godwin that he can have his lands back if Godwin gives Ethel back to her. Now, again, this was Edward asking for his brother back, which obviously that couldn't happen, and it was one of the reasons that caused Godwin to flee. Now, all this distribution of land, was in effect undone when Godwin returned in 1052. The episode also has Emma talking about undoing Alfred's work. Now, this would have been against her interest because it would have reduced the power of her son Harthacnut and later Edward, because he would be dividing the kingdom up into separate petty kingdoms and lessening their overall power as king. So again, that's not really accurate. Godwin and his sons all go off to Flanders at the end of the episode, with Edith being captured. This is not entirely correct. Godwin, Sven, Tostig and Gurth, who is not mentioned in the series at all, goes off to Flanders. While Harold and Leofwine, who is also not mentioned, they go off to Ireland. Now, both of these two groups would actually raise forces and they would ultimately join up in the following year, as discussed a moment ago. It is not known what happened to Edith during this time. The episode continues with Edward trusting Emma and that she had kept him alive. Historically, this is open to interpretation. By sending her sons into exile in Normandy and marrying Canute, it could be argued that this basically saved their lives. The flip side of this is that Canute was ruthless in trying to secure his dynasty. He would execute Edward's older half-brother Eardwig and 3 other nobles, including Eadric's Joan, in 1017. He would also go on to execute his own brother-in-law, Ulf the Earl, in 1026, and he would, so it is said, send Edmund Ironside's son, Edward the Exile, and Edmund to Sweden to have them dispatched, but the King of Sweden couldn't do that, and he, in the end, sent them off to the Canavian Rus, and they ended up in Hungary. So that if Edward and Alfred got into Canute's hands, what would their fate have been? Considering how ruthless Canute actually was. Added to this, Emma would prioritise her youngest son, Harthacnut, over both her other sons, Edward and Alfred, until it became convenient for her to remember her other sons in exile. In addition, Emma was not behind the whole plot, as the episode shows. I mean, she had very little political power at this point in time. The show has William escaping into exile into Flanders, and Henry wants William gone and hunts him down. And while on the run, Matilda gives birth to a son, and with William being distant to his son. Now, historically, William was not driven into exile by Henry. In fact, the 2 campaigns Henry conducted against William in 1054 and 1057 failed. And in terms of William's son, Robert, he would actually later rebel against his father when his father refused to share power with him. Now, in terms of Henry wanting William gone, by the 1050s, that is true because, well, he launched 2 campaigns to unseat him, but as mentioned, both these campaigns failed. The drama of the show continues to be flat and forgettable, and the history is all jumbled up and wrong. Unfortunately, fiction does stretch history to varying degrees, and this has varying degrees of tolerance for it. And they have stretched history a bit too much for this show. More than a bit, in fact. I don't think that the show is worth watching. Reading actual history is far better and more worthwhile than watching this show, I think. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.